So I'm actually not here to talk about communism. I just really like that dog. And what I'm actually here to talk about... Oh, we got a clicker. Your keyboard cannot be identified. Ooh.
This is just the first talk.
This is fine. This is fine.
Hashtag this is fine.
Didn't work. Turn it on. Good. Ah,
there you go.
Awesome. Where was I? Yes. Not communism, actually. I'm here to talk about something that has often been compared to communism by those who don't like it, which is in fact open source. And just going to dive right in. I want to start off by telling you a little story about this fellow called Richard Stallman. In 1984, or thereabouts, Richard encountered the printer. So Richard was working at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab back in the day. And they'd just gotten a new printer. So this is something they used to do, the hardware manufacturers of the time. The MIT AI Lab, among others, had a reputation for having a lot of clever people there. So they would give them free hardware and expect good feedback and software patches back. And it was all very nice. So they just got a new printer from Xerox. They just made this thing called a photocopier. And they'd figured that, in fact, this photocopier thing could be turned into a printer as well, instead of just receiving the image data from the photo part of the photocopier. They could actually just pipe data from a computer into the printer part of the photocopier. And this was all very new and exciting back then. It was like even more exciting than laser printers. In fact, the previous printer they had was a laser printer that had the unfortunate habit of printing circles as ovals and diagonal lines as sort of sine waves and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, the Xerox engineers had designed this thing to be basically crude at all times. There would always be somebody at the photocopier making photocopies. So a design priority was not to make sure that the thing doesn't jam. It was more to make it easy for whoever was at the machine to unjam it, which is great for a photocopier, but not so great for a printer. So the problem occurred that the printer would get jammed a lot, and somebody would have to go and unjam it, which happened to Richard one day. He had a very large print job. He went to the printer about an hour later to check if it was done, and he found that not only was his print job not done, but the printer had jammed like 2 or 3 print jobs back. So he was very upset. This is something he'd actually dealt with previously as well. The old printer tended to jam as well, because printers. And what he'd done is, so he was not a technical engineer, so he couldn't make the printer jam less, but what it could do was patch the software so that it would pull the printer, see if it was jammed, and if it was, it would email everybody in the print queue saying the printer is jammed, you should go fix it, on the theory that if you just email the person whose job has gotten jammed, they might not be responsible enough to go fix it, but it's more likely, if you email everybody, that somebody's going to go sort it out for you. So Richard decided to implement this patch for the new printer as well. So he went to look for the printer driver software, and he couldn't find it. He wasn't too worried. He knew that these things usually showed up eventually. Didn't even really bother pinging Xerox about it, just waited patiently for the software to surface, as it usually did. And a couple of months later, he decided he'd waited long enough. It didn't seem to be surfacing. So he asked around and discovered that the fellow who'd actually written the printer software had just left Xerox and taken up a professorship at Carnegie Mellon. to which Richard frequently had occasion to visit for work. So he just waited another month or so until he found himself at Carnegie Mellon and went to see the fellow who wrote the printer software and asked him, basically told him, Richard was an engineer and a nerd, so he was very terse. He just went to the fellow's office and said, hello, I'm Richard, I'm from MIT. We got your printer, can I have the software, because I'd like to patch it? And the fellow looked a bit uncomfortable and said, well, I'd love to give you the software, but I've signed an non-disclosure agreement, so I can't. And Richard had no idea how to even deal with this. It was an awkward social situation. So, being the person he was, he just basically said nothing, got up, and left, and felt very embarrassed and very furious about this situation. So, excuse me a moment. Basically, this is how the free software movement formed. Because Richard's anger at not getting that piece of printer driver sort of blossomed over the next couple of years into the idea that he needed to form a movement to make sure that software was always free and available, as it had been in the golden days of I suppose, US academic hacker culture, where everybody shared software freely among each other, and nobody saw any reason to actually sort of hoard software and guard its secrets. So what came out of that was the Free Software Foundation and the GNU General Public License, or the GPL for short, which is a free software license that basically guards the principles that Richard decided on to safeguard the idea of free software. So basically, the free software movement is about the idea that software is a communal good and must stay in the public domain where it can be studied and modified freely. That's the heart of the free software idea. Right now we're in the late 80s, and at this point not too many people had actually even heard of free software. It wasn't a movement that was growing very quickly. Then in the mid-90s or thereabouts, this fellow called Raymond published a treatise called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which introduced a rival but very similar idea, a compatible idea of sorts, called open source. So this fellow, Raymond, published the text called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and the idea of this was more pragmatic than the free software movement. So software still remains in the open under open source, but the idea is not so much to preserve sort of the socialist ideal of sharing in free software, but it's more the practical notion that if software is out there in the open, then other people can review your code, other people can contribute to your code, and this is the way to make your code better, quite simply. It's a strictly utilitarian philosophy, unlike frankly, the socialism of free software, but still arguably has the greater good in mind. So the flagships of the open source movement at the time were Linux, the operating system, or the kernel, which was using the GPL license, but definitely sort of politically was more aligned with open source than free software. And there was this thing called Netscape, which started off from the other direction as a piece of proprietary software, which the company Netscape decided to make available under an open source license. And this turned into the Mozilla browser that we know today and the Mozilla Foundation. So the open source movement, which grew out of the 90s and the 2000s, tended to not be too keen on the GPL, depending rather on what they called permissive licenses, like BSD and MIT. These did not include the GPL's share-alike clauses, but was more about pragmatically allowing software to incorporate open source software without needing to share back necessarily, but preserving the rights you were granted under the license for the open source software specifically. So this was more in tune with the idea, with a pragmatic idea of open source that everybody can use this software for whatever they like, even to build proprietary software, but the software itself has to stay available. And getting to this decade, it sort of changed a bit. So you have the idealism of free software, and you have the pragmatism of open source, and it's sort of turning into something altogether new again. It's something a bit like art, maybe, programming as self-expression, where the artist isn't concerned with community improvement or collective bug fixing, so much as putting their work out there to be appreciated for its own sake. We're still, I think we're still, as a community, trying to figure out the shape of this new community. But it's really exciting to me because, in many ways, this has been my own motivation for writing software from the very start. And you don't want to know how far back that went. But now I feel like people are actually writing software just for the fun of it or for the art of it. And I think that's really wonderful. But in summary, whether you see open source as socialism or pragmatism or even art, what it all boils down to ultimately, and this is what makes it so extremely important as an idea, is that open source gives us agency. And what I mean by that is that open source actually grants us the power, first of all, as Richard demanded, to create. So we have the source code for the software we use available to us so that we can easily customize it, improve it, and repair it as we see fit, which empowers us as users as well as programmers, and it enhances the larger community of users and programmers. And this is perhaps the most important of all. It also gives us the power to learn how software is built. We have the vast bulk of open source software available to us, and we have the ability to examine it, to learn how it works, and how to build similar systems of our own. And anyone can do this. I mean, given the admittedly not unrestricted resource of time at least, there are no gatekeepers to the knowledge. It's readily accessible to anybody without needing to pay anything, without needing to get accepted into a university or anything like that. It's all right out there in the open, and that is actually really powerful. That's what's so crucially important about the idea of open source. So to clarify this, whoa, we're missing a slide. Oh no. There was an extra slide, right. Okay, to clarify, let me tell you the story of the man who wanted to go to Mars. Let's call him Elon, after the fictional Martian leader from a science fiction story by some rocket scientist, I forget. Coincidentally, of course. So his ambition is no less than to actually send humans to Mars and put a human colony on the planet Mars. Now, interestingly, at least for the short term, his company, SpaceX, is actually developing the technology they need to facilitate going to Mars out in the open, citing the fact that their only real competitors are public interest agencies like NASA, which actually don't keep their work a secret at all. So it's all happening in the open. They're all sharing their technological advances openly, including this commercial operator, SpaceX. And my mic is falling off. Just a second. There we go. So in a very real sense, you could say that SpaceX is an open source company in a larger open source community, just that they're not actually doing software so much as space, as it were. Now, imagine if this were not the case. Imagine perhaps if someone with different ideas about intellectual property were in charge of the company. This, of course, this picture is randomly chosen. Imagine if the knowledge needed to send our species to another planet was locked away inside some company's intellectual property vaults, as it were. Imagine if some company was the gatekeeper to humanity's ability to actually go and colonize the universe. And pulling back a bit from the grand vision of space travel, imagine if companies controlled the knowledge of how to write different kinds of software inside their corporate silos. Imagine if the only way to learn how to be a serious programmer was to sign up with some giant corporation, and you were only allowed to use the knowledge you gained from it as directed by the corporation, or you would get shut down by patent lawsuits or similar. This is just the sort of thing that keeps me up at night, honestly. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not ultimately about the software that we write. It's about the knowledge we put out there of how to build the software that we write. The programs we leave behind, they're not really our legacy as programmers. What we're really contributing is the knowledge that we develop, the knowledge that we discover, and the knowledge that we pass on. So to me, it's actually really important that we think very seriously about how we protect that knowledge, which belongs to all of us, from being locked away behind walls of intellectual property and whatnot. So I'm sorry, I'm going to get into the legal details now. The GPL I mentioned happens to be one mechanism for this. And I've got actually a cheat sheet for you. Now, if you believe in this idea of preserving the knowledge at all costs, you'll want to use a license that actually ensures that this happens. So the GPL says that not only must your code remain freely available, it also cannot be linked with proprietary software. So the idea there is to encourage everything to exist in a fully open ecosystem. Now, if you have the term viral applied to the GPL, that was sort of Microsoft's way of referring to this idea in as negative a way as they could think of. And the GPL is actually really strict about this, but in the interest of sort of the socialist ideal of sharing knowledge. There's also a less demanding version of the GPL called the lesser GPL, LGPL. And there's also the Mozilla Public License, which kind of makes the same requirements as the GPL, but it's still it's constrained just to your particular project or even particular files inside that project. So if you think the GPL kind of goes a little bit too far, you might want to have a look at the Mozilla license, which is also quite decent. And finally, if you're not actually making software, but things like writing or visual art or music, then you can consider the Creative Commons share-alike license. Share-alike is a particular clause on the Creative Commons license, which says that you're free to copy and modify this as you please, but you have to, if you do so, you have to publish your derivative work under the same license, making it too freely available. Now, this is all from the perspective of somebody who really wants to make sure that free software happens. You might not be that person. I am, but it's totally reasonable for, and actually a lot more common for people to just want to make sure that their work is freely available to everybody, and that everybody can use it as they like. This is basically open source. And in this case, I'd like to make a plea to you, because I think the most popular license for this by far is the MIT license, and BSD is also quite up there. But can I ask you, please, if this is how you feel about software, consider the Apache license. Because MIT is all quite fine as a license. It's very short, which a lot of people like, but a lot of the protections it offers are implied by the wording of the MIT license, being as short as it is. Like, for instance, patent protections. The MIT license says something like, everybody's free to use the software without restriction, which implies there has to be a patent grant if the author of the software owns the patent for the software as well. Now, the Apache license actually has things like this, the patent grant, in plain text inside the license, so it's an explicit grant. Whereas MIT tends to usually hold up in court for this sort of thing, it is actually a lot better to have this language specifically in the license. So if you're on the permissive side of open source, I would like to urge you to please consider the Apache license for your next project rather than MIT. Or, of course, the GPL or the Mozilla license, if you like. So, just at the end, this is where it gets sort of, this is the awkward part of the talk, because it would be almost dishonest of me not to address what might well be considered the elephant in the room at this point, because we all know that our community leaders sometimes turn out to be a bit rubbish. And Richard, as it happens, Richard Stallman, is not necessarily an exception to this. I don't think he's actually malicious in any real sense, but the truth is he occasionally says some pretty awful things. I don't think he means to hurt people, but it's more a matter of not knowing quite how to behave properly in civilized society. And I mean, I don't mean to excuse him, actually. It is a bit problematic for the leader of the free software movement to behave in this way, and maybe it's time for him to step down. And when it comes to Eric Raymond, I'm not even going to go there. He's literally the worst person in existence. I just feel it's important to mention that. And my purpose in going to this rather dark place at the end of the talk is to stress that even though the idea of open source may not always have sort of sprung from the most saintly of people, it's not about the people in the end. We shouldn't be treating these people as heroes. We should not really be treating anybody as heroes. And what matters is the ideal of open source, of whichever direction you approach it from, whether it's from the left or from the right, or permissive, restrictive, care or don't care, all of that. It's not about the people, it's about the idea. And the idea, what it comes down to in the end, is the knowledge embedded in the community. That's what's so important to protect. The knowledge of how to write software, and more broadly, the knowledge of how to do anything we as humans are able to do. Even one day, you and me, we're going to go to the stars. And the knowledge to do that, we must preserve that at all costs. And that is what open source is really all about. Thank you so much for enduring this. Enjoy the dog.